of the nation. Let's join the pollster Joe Twyman, the founder and director of Delta Poll. Thank you for making the time this morning. It's been, of course, not enough time to see if polls have shifted with regard to the Gavin Williamson story. But just as a background, how is Rishi Sunak doing? At the start of this week, where were things set?
Well, the most recent poll that here at Delta Poll we have published shows that the Conservatives have an 18-point lead over over Labour. Sorry, excuse me. Labour have an 18-point lead over the Conservatives, and that's a slight contraction on where they have been in recent polling, suggesting that Rishi Sunak is performing better than Liz Truss. We know that certainly from the leadership ratings. He's doing a lot better than she was on that personal rating, but also the gap between Conservative and Labour has closed under his leadership. But it's still a large gap for the Labour Party, and the Conservatives have some way to go before that is closed.
Yes, an absolutely enormous gap that in normal times we would be commenting upon as something that was in a pretty dire position for the Tory party. But what about the particulars in terms of how Rishi Sunak is perceived as an individual? Clearly, a lot of the political attacks on judgment will be trying to change public perceptions in terms of how Rishi Sunak is seen. Is he seen as more competent?
Well, what I would say at the moment is that actually most people are still making up their mind. And in some cases, they are giving him the benefit of the doubt. And in many cases, indeed, he benefits from being compared to Liz Truss. He's certainly seen as more competent than her. He's certainly seen as a safer pair of hands. But as stories such as Gavin Williamson's resignation start to gain momentum, I think we could potentially see a change in that perception. And indeed, it may influence those people who don't yet know into coming down one side or the other. I think this particular story is an interesting one, but a relatively minor one. I think the issues and stories around Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, are potentially more damaging because Gavin Williamson was a relatively minor person in cabinet. He was minister without portfolio. Most people, perhaps even Gavin Williamson included, don't know exactly what that means, and so that's less of a major issue. But it still all helps feed these narratives about whether Rishi Sunak is really a competent, safe pair of hands, or whether he's just doing better than Liz Truss.
And how much time have people really had to make up their minds? I remember reading I think it was the Times last week, of all of these different attributes that Rishi Sunak has, or indeed facts about him. I think it was Philip Cowley, the academic, who asked the question of people, facts about Rishi Sunak. You know, was he wealthy? Did he go to this particular school? Did he vote Remain or Leave? And on some of those issues, the British public seemed fairly confused. A lot of people who voted Leave didn't necessarily realise that Rishi Sunak himself voted Leave. Is he particularly presenting himself as something more palatable, perhaps what we might call towards the blue wall rather than the red wall?
It's always worth keeping in mind that the average person in the street and the 50% of people less engaged in the average person in the street really isn't paying that much attention to politics. In the summer, when the previous leadership election ran, only 2/3 of people said that they would even recognise Rishi Sunak if they passed him in the street. So that's even a third of people not knowing what he looks like, let alone what his positions were on various different subjects, or indeed much about his background. And so by virtue of the fact that he's Prime Minister, inevitably people know more about him over time. But it does take time. And I think it's too early to judge whether he particularly appeals to one set of Conservative voters or another, because he very much is a blank sheet of paper at the moment in public opinion terms. Now, that can be a good thing, because it means that you do have the potential, at least, to appeal to certain groups, certain communities, and to win people over. But it can also be a bad thing that people simply don't pay attention to you, and you're unable to cut through to get your points across and build a favourable narrative around your leadership.
Well, speaking of blank sheets of paper, let's turn our view to the leader of the opposition, who has been criticised, I suppose, similarly to Rishi Sunak as having multiple positions on multiple issues over the years. How do people see the Labour Party leader right now, as opposed to the Labour Party's brand?
Keir Starmer is doing relatively well, certainly by historical standards. He's consistently in positive territory when it comes to whether people think he's doing a good or bad job. In other words, more people think he's doing a good job than a bad job. And that may seem like a low bar, but as I say, by historical standards, that's actually doing quite well. But again, he is a relatively unknown quantity. Now, part of that is to do with the fact that for a good period of time during the early stages of his leadership, it was the height of the COVID pandemic, and all attention, quite understandably, was on the government and government ministers. But since we've seen that period of time end, he has started to resonate more with the public, and he is doing well, as indeed is the Labour Party more generally. The question, of course, for him is, can this be sustained, and how will he perform compared to Rishi Sunak? So not just in absolute terms, but relative terms as well. At the moment, it's pretty much neck and neck. Some polls have Starmer ahead, some polls have Sunak ahead. But as I say, I think that's more of a reflection of at times wishful thinking around both candidates rather than actually making a considered view about either one.